Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ian Trevethan. I am the Education and Outreach Manager at the Sternberg Museum of Natural History. Unfortunately, Reese has a Zoom meeting right now, so he was not able to join me for this live feed. So it's just me. I'm on my own, but at least I'm at the museum, which is a good thing. So this afternoon, we're going to sort of do a retread of what we were talking about, or at least some of the things we were talking about yesterday during our live feed yesterday afternoon. On review of the live feed, and also, because of some of the comments that I got, I realized that the live feed was pretty rough because we kept cutting in and out. And while you kind of got the gist of what I was talking about, I'm probably going to revisit some of the things that I was talking about. So the theme today is sort of, what do you do when you work at a museum and you want to talk about a thing, but you don't have that thing? And pretty much nobody has those things. And you need to have that thing for the program you want to do. Well, my answer is you make that thing. So in many of the cases, the things that I find myself in need of often involve large creatures. Sometimes it involves skeletons of large creatures. And sometimes, even though I work in a fossil museum, the skeletons of said large creatures are not always readily available and are certainly prohibitive when you start to look at what it would take to purchase, let's say, a cast of a large dinosaur skeleton, and you want to talk about dinosaur skeletal anatomy. Well, that can be tough and cost prohibitive. And, most of the time that I have been an active educator here at the museum, we haven't had a lot of people who are able to do casting and molding of large objects. So we can do a little bit of that, but in general, if I wanted something large, I would have to go to another source, which usually means spending some money, which we don't have a huge amount of. So that leaves me with utilizing some of my more unique skills, which, as I said yesterday, I was kind of one of those people, even when I was a kid, where I would sort of see things on television or in the movies, and I would really, it wasn't enough to go, wow, that's a really cool thing. I would want to know how that thing was made, what it was made of, what the process of, finding the materials that some of these things were made of, and in a lot of cases, these were, movie props or masks or costumes of weird creatures and robots and dinosaurs. So, I, from a pretty early age, developed, I don't know if it's a curse or if it's a skill, of looking at things in a different light. So instead of an old couch cushion, I saw the building materials for a dragon head, for example. Or instead of, hey, that's an old rubber car mat, I saw the makings for part of a costume that could be made into a Borg from Star Trek. Hey, that's a battery-powered Christmas light. That's really cool. I could use that. So I was always kind of one of those weird kids that had Halloween costumes in January. I was always trying to figure out ways to make things into other things. And it caused me some problems when I was, as I was growing up, because, it was an odd skill. It didn't exactly fit into a regular workplace, especially when, all you're qualified for is working a retail store. So I was a pretty bored kid up until I decided to go to college. And really, it wasn't until I started working at a museum that I was finally able to realize that some of these odd skills that I had developed on my own were actually really kind of useful. So, that's sort of my lead up to the theme now is, in museum life, we deal with some pretty cool things. Now, I've got a great many museum specimens available to me. So, through the graciousness of our zoological collections manager, I'm able to utilize many, many study skins and taxidermy mounts and skeletons of, all of the zoological specimens. If I need them, all I have to do is go and ask. That's great. It's an awesome resource. I also have that same leeway most of the time in paleo. If I, go and ask, hey, can I use these big fossil casts, or can I use this particular specimen for this particular program? Usually I'm allowed to do that. We have a teaching collection. That's what it's used for, and I try to utilize that. But every once in a while, I run into a particular challenge where I want to talk about something, and we don't have that thing. In fact, nobody has that thing. So I'm going to kind of talk about where my brain goes. And again, in part, this will be a little bit of a review. You'll see some things that I talked about yesterday. In particular, some of the material that I'm working for building what was going to be a traveling exhibit, sort of program exhibit for this summer to go along with the Kansas Library reading programs. But we're living in such a weird time now. I'm in a little bit of doubt whether that's going to happen in the way that I had originally planned. But I think there might be a solution for that. So we'll get to that here in just a bit. But for example, one of the first challenges I came up against when I started sort of working as an educator here at the Sternberg Museum was one of the most popular things within the museum. Up in our main exhibit gallery on our third floor, we have a little dig pit where theoretically it's supposed to be children can go, and it's a little sandbox, and they can take shovels and brushes, and they can uncover exact replicas of the fossils that are in our main fossil gallery exhibit, which is really cool. And honestly, I have seen many adults in there doing the same thing. So to me, that is a really, really good indication that that is a great hands-on activity for both children and adults. Often what really gets kids involved in interaction with science also works with adults. So one of the things I wanted to do is, how do I take that concept, that dig pit concept, and make that something that can travel to, in this case, summer programs and libraries and, that kind of stuff, where I can bring something that is interactive like a dig pit, like we've got upstairs, and bring that to a location outside of the museum. So that was a challenge. And of course, one of the things that people grab onto is dinosaurs. Even though most of our fossil collection primarily focuses on Cretaceous marine organisms, a lot of people fly right past that and think dinosaurs. So dinosaurs to me is a really good way to grab people, get them into, sort of plug them into learning about the science that I specialize in, which is paleontology. So one of the first things I wanted to do was build a mobile dig pit that represents a dinosaur specimen that I really kind of grew to love when I was in Montana. This is supposed to be a representation of a Tenontosaur. So without further ado, I will introduce you to my first endeavor in not having something readily available and creating it on my own. So boom, here we go. This was my first attempt at building a mobile dig pit. And while I consider it mostly a successful endeavor, there were some problems and I did learn from it. And that's what's cool about sort of being forced to come up with your own solution in finding ways to make what you need rather than to go out on the open market and buy it. Aside from being really expensive, sometimes these things are hard to find. And really, how often can you go out or call, let's go to Amazon.com and say, hey, I'm looking for a Tenontosaurus kill site. And I need it to be a dig pit. What do you think the likelihood of me actually being able to find that was? Not too high. So what I ended up doing was building one on my own. So how this started was actually, you can see here, there's a bit of the epoxy chipped away here. So what I used is actually, this is information, this is insulation foam. So it's about, I would say about an inch or two thick. And what I discovered early on is this material is really easy to carve. It's very sandable, and I can carve it into just about any shape that I need. And, I wanted to represent a dinosaur skeleton that was based upon an actual fossil, and in this case, very loosely based. But I wanted to be able to tell people a story, and I will share that story with you in just a minute. But, what I ended up doing was I took these chunks of styrofoam and I kind of fashioned them into, and this is mostly from memory, and a couple of really blurry pictures that I took just before I moved away from Bozeman, Montana, where I was going to school at Montana State. So this is not going to be anatomically absolutely accurate, but it was good enough to do what I needed it to do, which was tell a story. In this case, it's sort of the taphonomy, which is sort of the fancy word of saying what happened to this animal from the time it died to the time that it was recovered by paleontologists. So what I did was I carved out the pieces as best I could to represent the different parts of the skeleton that I felt were important for this particular program or activity. And then I covered, once I glued the styrofoam onto the back to the board that I found, and I just, I didn't plan on having this shape. This was just an odd shaped piece of wood that I found out in the back of our shop, and it looked to be about the right size. And so I sort of worked with that shape. I didn't cut that. That was just a scrap of wood that I found. So I glued the carved pieces, unpainted pieces of styrofoam, once I had them shaped, onto the board. And then we actually covered it with a sort of an epoxy coating. So this is kind of a hard sort of resin coating. Painting styrofoam of any kind, but in this case, painting insulation foam is very, very difficult. You have to use an acrylic paint. You can't use like a spray paint because what the spray paint does is it'll actually melt the styrofoam. So if you've ever tried to paint acrylic paint directly onto styrofoam, it's doable, but you have to paint several layers in order to get the colors to get really dark, because it's sort of like painting on a napkin. That styrofoam will absorb a lot of the moisture. It'll absorb a lot of the paint. So you really have to paint several layers. So in this case, we covered the bones, the skeleton pieces, with an epoxy coating. And that allowed me to be able to paint the stuff on without using up a tremendous amount of paint. And so I was able to sort of match the colors. And again, this is me working by memory. I was trying to remember what color the actual fossils were. And in this case, this is a representation of a Tenontosaurus, and it was a kill site. So you'll notice that after I got everything glued on and everything painted, I needed to add a backing that sort of looked like, in this case, I wanted it to look like mudstone. So what I ended up doing is I actually took some joint compound, which is basically like wall spackle. And I sort of did this sort of texture that sort of loosely resembled what I remember the mudstone slab that the original fossil was in looking like. And you can see since I originally did this, it's been sort of touched up and repainted a little bit, because as I was saying yesterday, one of the challenges of taking any sort of fossil cast, museum specimen is if it's on the road with you a lot, the likelihood of it getting damaged or rubbed or scratched is pretty high. So even when you're being really, really careful, which is why I prefer to work with casts, and when I do check out zoological specimens or paleontological specimens, I'm really, really, really careful that they don't get damaged. And if they do, I'm sure to point it out to the collections managers and to the curators. So it is, it's a challenge because you don't want your stuff to get messed up, which is another advantage to just making your own stuff, because it would be a bummer if this thing got ruined, and I really, really try hard not to have that happen. But if something broke on this, it wouldn't be hard to repair, and it wouldn't come at the cost of an expensive replica or, God forbid, the cost of a irreplaceable scientific specimen. So once I got the background put in there, and I got sort of put a frame on it because I wanted to be able to contain what I ended up using for sediment here. Initially, I was going to use coarse sand. Well, remember, this thing was supposed to be a transportable dig pit. And what I very, very, very quickly discovered was taking enough sand to fill this thing up and cover up the skeleton was a tremendous undertaking, and it was very, very heavy. We're talking many, many big white buckets of sand, and that didn't really work well with transportation. So the other thing was it was a pain to clean back up. So what I discovered instead was ground up corn cob, which looks like coarse sediment, and it's about 10 times lighter than a bucket of sand. So I was able to get several bags of this ground corn cob and throw it in here and basically cover the skeleton so it basically looked like a pit of sand. And the idea is the audience, whether it's kids or adults, get to clean it off and expose the skeleton, and they get to interpret what happened. So that worked really well for several years. But after a while, I eventually tired of bringing buckets of sediment and then struggling to get it all cleaned up after everybody was done with it. And especially if this was somewhere like in a library. If the weather was nice and I could go outside, no problem. But if I ended up being in a locality that was inside, I would have to really, really be careful about cleaning this stuff up. It would take a lot of time. Usually it was just me. And so not only am I having to load all this stuff up by myself, but then I have to go back and make sure everything gets swept up and, have a vacuum with me and all that stuff. And I decided that maybe the dig pit idea was well intended, but it wasn't quite as practical as I once thought. But I didn't want to completely jettison the idea altogether. So you'll notice that I started drawing lines in here. You'll notice that I have them numbered from 1 to 4. So there's slot 1, slot 2, slot 3, and slot 4. And what I decided to do is sort of rework this into a new exercise where I take groups of, usually it's children, usually I use this for a school presentation when I want to talk about how we interpret and tell the stories that fossils have to tell. And I'll divide the group of kids up into 4 smaller groups. And each group gets to look at a section. So, it's a group of, 4 small groups. Each group looks at each section. They get assigned section 1 or section 2 or section 3 and so on. And they get to write down all the evidence that they see. And then when the big group is all back together, I have each group tell me what they saw. And then we sort of discuss what all of that evidence means together. And then we try to interpret what the story is. So in this case, the story behind this skeleton is this is a Tenontosaurus kill site. And if you look closely, I've got what are casts of They've been pretty beat up, so they're not as sharp as they once were. But these are casts of raptor teeth. And what that indicates is there were raptors here, and they were feeding. And while they were feeding, they shed teeth. And this also tells us that this is more than one raptor. This is probably a pack of raptors, because for one raptor to shed, what is this, 12, 15 teeth, that would be an unlikely scenario. So what that means is there was a group of raptors. They probably hunted this animal. Initially, I wanted to have tooth marks in the bone, but I lost the detail of those tooth marks when I covered the bones in the epoxy covering. So there are some tooth marks in there, but they're not very obvious. So, I usually point those out to the group while we're discussing it. So the story behind this is a Tenontosaur who was hunted by a pack of, in this case, Deinonychus or Deinonychus, which are mid-sized North American raptors. And that's what this fossil represents, is basically a kill site. And the evidence is tooth marks on the bone. And so that's one example of me coming up with a dinosaur when I didn't have one. And that turned out to be a really eye-opening experience, that suddenly I'm utilizing all of my weird skills. Aside from being able to talk way too much and excitedly tell people about nerdy fossil facts, I was also able to use this weird skill that I had been developing all my life. So again, hi Hannah, I'm doing a live feed. Please don't call me. So that's my daughter. This sort of evolved as I took over being the museum educator here at the Sternberg. And I sort of took a little bit of a different direction when it came to using different methods to talk about natural history concepts. So a few years ago, I proposed to some of my colleagues here that maybe we look at using pop culture as a doorway to scientific discovery, for lack of better words. So for example, I'm a big Star Wars dork. Everybody who knows me knows that I'm that guy. I'm the guy that has all the stuff. So I thought it'd be really, really fun to do a Star Wars Day in which we tie natural history, and in this case, the history of Kansas, natural history of Kansas, and compare it to some facet of the make-believe world of Star Wars. So in this case, we look at animals, we look at geology, we look at, what can we compare in this fictional world to our science world, and use that as a fun vehicle for people to learn. So as you can imagine, Lucasfilm props are not readily available in general, but especially in Western Kansas. So one of the things that I ended up doing was, again, creating my own props. And I don't have the biggest one here, but I've got one example here. So this is my crystal fox. I built this actually for, this was last summer's traveling education program. And this was also meant to accompany or to pair with the Kansas Library Summer Reading Program. And last year that theme was a universe of stories. So I thought, well, what's the coolest story of the universe? Well, it's got to be Star Wars. So I took some animals from the Star Wars universe and I paired them up with some of our zoological specimens from our collection here at the museum. And we compared and contrasted the make-believe animals to the scientific specimens that we have here in the museum. So one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to have a really impressive life-size references or representatives of the Star Wars universe. So the first thing I did was I built a tauntaun, which is about, I don't know, 8 feet long and stands about 7 feet tall. Tauntauns are featured in Empire Strikes Back. They're the weird two-legged creatures that they're riding around on the ice planet of Hoth at the very beginning. So I built one of those, and that was an adventure. And then I built this guy. This is a Vulptex fox that is featured in The Last Jedi, which is not my favorite Star Wars movie, but we don't need to go there right now. But what Vulptex foxes are little fox-like animals that have, instead of fur, they have crystalline shapes on, that act as fur. So I had to figure out how to build a fox. Now, there are things that I learned while I was doing this. There are things that I would do very, very differently. But, the way I think sometimes is not, I think, what most people would consider intuitive. So I basically built this thing from scratch, starting with a skeleton and, using, I think I was using a Swift fox as my sort of model. And what I actually ended up doing is I actually took, I said that we don't have the ability to mold and cast big objects, but we do have the ability to make casts and molds of smaller objects. So in this case, I made a cast of a fox skull. So there is actually a fox skull under this that is attached to the skeleton that I built. And then I put a layer of, basically, it's kind of a mixture between plaster and paper mache. That is the skin. So I was able to sort of form some musculature and some body, and I ended up with something that looks like this. Now, while it worked for my objective, this was something that really did grab people's attention. They were impressed with it. You can imagine the amount of work. All of these crystals were placed by hand. There are several thousand there. And I was actually going from what I saw from behind the scenes at Lucasfilm. I was looking at their original concept models. And so I basically tried to do as best I could what they did. There are a couple of things I would do differently now. I don't necessarily think I've got the proportions of the fox skeleton quite right. I think I got the back end really right, but the front end to me looks funny. And part of where I messed up is I didn't elongate the neck enough. So what I would do differently if I were to do this over now that I've learned is I would actually get a proper taxidermy mount of a Swift fox. And why this didn't occur to me before I went and built a skeleton and then shaped the body around it and then put thousands and thousands of little crystals on the body is beyond me. But now I know. So if I ever want to attempt to do this again, which I may do that someday, that's what I would do differently is I would actually save myself a couple of painful steps in just starting with a Swift fox taxidermy body and putting the crystals on that, and then I don't have to worry about constructing from square one. So again, a very, very interesting experience, and something that, although I see all the mistakes I made here, something I can kind of be proud of. And, I did have help. I had several students that helped me with this when I started to lose my sanity after spending hours and hours and hours on all these crystals. So all of these were hand glued on there. And I think it's fair to say this thing was abandoned more than it was finished. But, it makes for an interesting conversation piece, let's call it that. So the next thing that was kind of interesting was I started to get, yes, Hannah, you were helpful too. So very helpful all the time. So one of the interesting things, So Anne is asking, would I have to shave a taxidermy fox in order to put on the crystals? The answer there is no. Basically, the taxidermy mount bodies are basically, for all intents and purposes, styrofoam that have actually been put in a body form, and actually it's poured in a liquid form, and then it foams up and it dries. So basically what you get is a styrofoam representation of a shaved fox body. So that gives you a much more anatomically correct body form with which to work. So that's the answer to that question, and that's why I think that particular approach would work better than what I did the first time around. So if I ever do this a second time, which I might, depending on demand for my Zoology of Star Wars program. So back to what I was saying, one of the really interesting things that started happening for me was we employ and teach a lot of students here in the museum. As I've said before, the Sternberg Museum is part of Fort Hays State University, and we have biology students, we have paleontology and geology students. We even get students from other departments like art and communications. And this is a really, really great place for students to learn about a range of things, from public education to, learning about biology to, learning how to be fossil preparators. So I always say this is one of the best classrooms in the world, and I really, really do believe that. So I can't remember what I was saying. Oh yeah, so I started to get students coming up to me with ideas, saying, hey, would it be okay if we did this? And one of those ideas was one of our graduate students, Chase Shelburne, who is now our acting paleontology collections manager, came up to me a couple of years ago, I think it was after a Star Wars Day, and said, hey, I really like what you did with Star Wars Day. Can we do something that is Pokemon themed? And I was like, well, sure, but I don't know anything about Pokemon, so I'll be here in an advisory capacity, but it's all you. And man, did he run with it. And it turns out that Pokemon is huge, and the Pokemon event has become such a strong contender that we are actually on year 3 now, and we've got some pretty impressive things. But, we started out pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? Low budget, that's the word. Where do you find, we wanted to do something impressive that represents these little Pokemon creatures, and we wanted them to be as impressive as the Star Wars stuff was, and we wanted them to be able to compete in the same arena as our animatronic dinosaurs. But where do you find life-size Pokemon? Well, back to my old philosophy, if you don't have it, you make it. So this was our first stab at making a life-size Pokemon. And you can see this is pretty much two-dimensional. I mean, it's three-dimensional and the fact that it sits upright, but, you can see that it is not a full representation. But we actually built several sort of life-size representations of the different kinds of Pokemon. And they were lighted and had really cool kind of like dynamic lighting, and each one of them had fossil specimens or zoological specimens that we were comparing to them. And as it turns out, I guess the Pokemons have a very interesting evolutionary history, which I was not aware of until I saw the students that I was working with go crazy with this. So again, the really cool thing here was I didn't do a whole lot of this. What had happened is I had apparently unwittingly inspired students, other people, to go and run with this philosophy. So to me, that's one of the most gratifying things to have come out of this crazy thing that I do is I have had a number of students now work closely with me to learn how to take everyday objects and make them into things that we can use to communicate science to the general public. Lynn, the fish within the fish is in our main fossil gallery on the second floor. We are currently on the, okay. Hopefully you got my answer there, Lynn. The fish within a fish is in our third floor fossil gallery, second floor fossil gallery. We are on the third floor in a classroom up here, so it's not within view. So moving on to what I was sort of showing you yesterday was these are dragons. And these are dragons that are in the process of being fabricated for an exhibit that is going to be called From Mythology to Paleontology. And the idea is this will pair with fossils that may have, at least in part, inspired mythological creatures. So again, this is using that same idea that we can take something that is from popular culture and use that as a vehicle to teach and get people interacting with actual science. So, as I sort of said yesterday, and I'll just sort of describe this briefly, this is meant to represent just sort of your traditional flying dragon that swoops down and, maybe eats a sheep or two and likes to hoard gold. And, this will sort of be our starting point with sort of introducing the mythology of dragons and what might have inspired that. And in fact, now that I'm looking at this dragon head with my Tenontosaur in the background, you can kind of already see where I'm going with this. That early explorers, let's say, early Greek explorers, a la and Alexander the Great, might have been going through areas in Asia and have seen something like a dinosaur skeleton and then been able to, sort of try to interpret that. And this is what they would come up with, would be sort of this mythical beast that now we know is not quite up to snuff when it comes to real, to actual science research, but it's a good starting point. These people would observe what they saw, and if you were to observe this looks like a strange beast with maybe a club tail, and it's got long bones, and it's like unlike anything we see living today. So wow. Maybe this thing had wings and maybe it was a two-legged thing. So there you go. Suddenly you've got the legend of a dragon just starting. And of course, this is my unfinished, this is our subterranean sort of underground sort of cave-dwelling dragon. And it was myself and 3 undergraduate students that are working on these concepts. And I've got to give the credit to them. They came up with these different kinds of dragons that would exist in different environments. So you see this guy actually has gills, which is kind of cool. He's sort of meant to look like almost like a paedomorphic salamander, like an axolotl or something, but he's going to have big teeth. And we envision this guy sort of living in a sort of an aquifer, like a network of underwater rivers and lakes underneath caves. So he's going to be very, like I said, translucent in color, very veiny. He's going to have like sort of eyes that dimly glow or reflect. So yeah, kind of looking like a water horse, but we're actually going to do a marine dragon that will have a much more I think classic sort of sea monster look. So we are going that way as well. So, we have our terrestrial, we have our subterranean, and then we'll have our marine dragon. And we're going to compare all of these to different kinds of fossils that represent different kinds of, of animals and different kinds of ecological niches. So again, this is using a very fantastic method, in this case, completely fictional animals, but we're comparing and contrasting them to actual specimens and talking about what we can learn from looking at the shape and the size of certain certain features, whether something is present or absent, and why is that? So again, not many dragons out there for sale on the market, certainly not the size that I was looking for. And, so when you don't have something and you really want something, but you don't want to pay a bunch of money for it, well, you make it. And when you make something, you can make it your own. And that's where we're going with this, is we didn't want it to look like something that somebody else made up and we just borrowed. That was the downside with the Star Wars idea, is I love Star Wars, but it's somebody else's idea. And, I don't think they mind if I play in their sandbox a little bit. But, in this case, these are animals that were completely created out of the minds of myself and the students I was working with. So that's exciting. So if there are any educators that are watching out here, here's the question I have for you, because this brings about two ideas of, no, Hannah, I can't make you a car, at least not out of styrofoam. It wouldn't be a very good car. So if there are any educators out there, my question here is, number one, I'm a little worried that most of the destinations that I had intended for this particular program, the paleontology or the mythology to paleontology program, will not be happening very soon. Just from all indications I'm hearing, we'll probably not be able to assemble in larger crowds until maybe June or July. So that really puts a dent in my bringing this out outside of the museum. So if I were to offer this online as maybe a live feed, or even if I were to record it and put it on YouTube, would this be something that would be of interest to educators? And the second part is, would there be interest in doing, let's say, maybe some live feed segments on the progress of making our dragons? Is there interest in seeing how this thing gets fabricated and where we're going to take this thing as we do it? So if there are any thoughts on that, please leave them in the text message spot, and let me know what you think. If there's interest in that, maybe we can pursue that. So the same thing goes for the Zoology of Star Wars program. I've got all the stuff for that. If there's an interest in seeing that either in a Zoom format or on a Facebook live feed like we're doing now, please let me know. We can arrange that. I can absolutely do those programs with an electronic delivery, because we're living in weird times, and this would be sort of a new and cool thing for people to see. So let me know. I'm going to say goodbye for this afternoon, and as always, we ask that you like and share our live feeds, and if you've got any questions or comments, be sure to leave them in the comments section. And if we are no longer live, I will do my best to get back to you in a timely fashion. So have a good afternoon. We will see you tomorrow. I'm not sure what we're going to be talking about, but we'll be talking about something. And stay healthy and happy, and let us know if there's anything that you need from us. All right, we'll talk to you later. Bye.